Hello, everyone. We're going to start momentarily. We're just letting everybody in the room. Just give us one moment. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jill Zippin. I'm one of the founders of the Jewish Battleground Coalition. And if you are out west in Arizona, I guess it is good morning to you. The Jewish Battleground Coalition is made up of Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Texas, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. Our goal is to keep our states blue, turn our states blue, and get Democrats elected in these key swing battleground states. We welcome you to our event, Critical Race Theory, Fact over Fiction from a Jewish Perspective. My name is Jill Zippin, and I am the chairwoman of Democratic Jewish Outreach Pennsylvania, which is the Pennsylvania portion of the Jewish Battleground Coalition. I would like to give a special thank you to Professor Sam Edelman, who represents Florida in the Jewish Battleground Coalition and help get together the speakers that we have here today. So thank you very much, Sam. There are many perspectives with respect to critical race theory, and often conversations around this issue can be difficult. However, we believe that difficult conversations are the ones worth having. Critical race theory impacts the Jewish community and how we think about Jewish education. And we hope that you all come away from this Zoom better educated on the issues as it relates to this topic. Many people outside of academia don't really understand the issue of critical race theory. We have 4 speakers who, in their opening statements, will give you their definition of critical race theory, and we hope will clarify the issues for you. We have 4 wonderful speakers. I will introduce each speaker, and then they will give a statement, and then we will go into Q&A. The first person I will introduce you to is Dr. Cary Nelson. He's a professor at the University of Illinois, an affiliate professor at the University of Haifa in Israel, and he was president of the American Association of University Professors from 2006 to 2012. And for all the Philly folks out there, he was born in Philadelphia. Dr. Nelson, why don't you begin with your statement?
Thank you. And thanks for Sam in setting up this opportunity. Critical race theory is simply factually a body of theoretical writing and speculation and definition that dates back decades. Literally, it's a body of theory that addresses the structural character of racial division and conflict in society. And I will disappoint some people by saying critical race theory is not primarily a dangerous intervention in how we run school lunch programs, although you could easily be dissuaded about that. So that said, let me begin on a querulous note. With the US sliding toward chaos, as I think it is, I think it's in some ways a bit indulgent to be talking about Jews and CRT, even though race is at the core of our national crisis. In any case, rather than try to differentiate 30 or 40 years of strengths and weaknesses in critical race theory, I want to set out some basic principles. It seems to me that any historically responsible analysis of critical race theory needs to begin with the facts. Race is the historical and ideological site of America's founding wound, one of 2 collective crimes at the origin of the country. The story of the country's commitment to and economic reliance on the radical exploitation and degradation of other human beings, Black slaves perceived as inferior, disposable, and less than human, is at least as fundamental to our identity as the ideals that inspired the Declaration and the Bill of Rights. These 2 stories cannot be disentangled except by racism itself. If you try to deal with only one and not the other, then I think the motivations for that are often racist. That they are frequently disentangled through racism is testimony to our national character. The legacy of that two-stranded DNA unfolds throughout our history and still throughout contemporary life. Its consequences now go well beyond a disabling race consciousness to include, I think, deeply embedded structural racism. If we as a nation were truly anguished about that legacy, we would at least have fully addressed some of its practical consequences that I think can be addressed. We would have eliminated discriminatory school funding and curricula, employment practices, healthcare, voting rights, housing, justice systems, educational opportunities. How many of us believe we will do so in our lifetimes? How many of us even believe we will eliminate the confidence within law enforcement that Black people can be killed with impunity? We've recently been through a national election substantially animated by racism. Heightened awareness of and opposition to racism as a consequence is countered by, unfortunately, intensified denial. The nation is being broken apart by much the same hatreds that produced the Civil War. Political polarization and mass hysteria over CRT has made rational discussion of the issues impossible in some settings. The astonishing racist frenzies at school board meetings highlight what is so frightening about the current political public sphere. These are unbridled efforts to deny the historical record based on fantasy projections onto CRT, which has become a catch-all for white resentment and rage, one Christopher Rufo has exploited. The enforcement of political orthodoxy on both the right and the left are tremendous impediments to productive dialogue. But the most threatening political problem is the Republican Party's unqualified commitment to racism and discrimination. The GOP's willingness to make CRT part of the culture wars feeds into the long-term American tradition of exploiting racism for political gain. Unlike the more fleeting obsessions of the culture wars, therefore, this episode can do lasting damage. And that will be added to the risk of triggering immediate violence. There are helpful ways to improve some of the efforts to clarify our history. The implications of the 1619 Project, for example, can be complicated by giving full attention to the history of African American cultural achievements, thereby adding the effects of agency to the history of victimization. The too often absurd policing of purportedly racist microaggressions also needs to be addressed. The important history of Black-Jewish collaboration in the civil rights movement needs to be revitalized. The pernicious element of anti-Semitism in the Black Lives Matter movement condemned far more widely. Those tasks present huge challenges. BLM anti-Semitism was allowed to spread too widely. Its exponents among BLM leadership tolerated when they should have been rejected. But a conservative Jewish response that follows the logic of, we care about racism, but needs to be called out for what it is, a disingenuous nod to anti-racism. It may be motivated at times by the desire to tap funding sources on the Jewish right. That CRT presses us to look in the mirror is fundamental to the why so many revile it. Identifying its mistakes and excesses is thoroughly honorable. It can only be done productively, however, if it's grounded in honesty about our history and its legacy. The need for revived alliances is apparent in the way racism and anti-Semitism both fueled the January assault on the Capitol. They have both spread online and in social media in ways we never encountered. But it's easier to call for multiracial, multi-ethnic alliances than to make them reality. Short-term casual commitments no longer work. Nonetheless, the new anti-Semitism does present both its horrors and its opportunities for understanding. But so long as anti-Zionism has a large, no longer marginalized place in Black activism, strong Black Jewish alliances will remain out of reach. Both communities have hard work to do. If CRT suggests the work that needs to take place is altogether lodged on one side, it will undermine its efficacy. The opportunity for more diverse alliances would benefit from incorporating more racial and ethnic groups, including Jews, into CRT. Comparison and contrast of how racism mutates and implicates different groups over time can only help understanding and the willingness to confront historical legacies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cary. Up next is Dr. Monica Osbourne. Dr. Monica Osbourne is editor-at-large for the Jewish Journal of Los Angeles. She's an expert in the area of CRT. She has a PhD in literature and Jewish studies and a graduate degree in critical theory. And she is in Los Angeles. Monica?
I'm going to set my timer here so I don't speak for too long. I'm not in Los Angeles.
Oh.
I moved to Italy. I needed to escape Los Angeles.
Oh. Okay.
Yeah, so this is my evening event. So again, thank you for including me on this panel. I wish I could say that this is something I really, really enjoy talking about, but the truth is that I don't. However, I feel like this is something I have to keep talking about because it's all over the place. And Jill, you asked us to give us our definitions of critical race theory. And, mine really isn't that much different than Cary's. I mean, as he said, factually speaking, critical race theory is a framework of analysis, right? It gives us a way to look at the world, things happening in our culture, in our society, through the lens of racial justice. And of course, critical race theory actually started in the legal world, and it was created as a way to address some of these racial disparities that were popping up in the legal world. And, I think I shouldn't say most people, but I want to say, that most reasonable people will agree that there was a need for critical race theory in this context. There was a need for the idea of intersectionality, which was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw and is often taught within the larger framework of critical race theory. There was a very real need for this lens, right? For this way of looking at, this element of society that we hadn't been considering. But I think the bigger and more relevant question is, what do we mean when we talk about critical race theory? And the problem is that we all mean different things. And I think that, if it's the right, the far right and the right, they talk about critical race theory in two different ways. I think whenever the far right talks about critical race theory, it's anything that has to do with race, right? And we were talking before the event started about how, books about race, or something by Maya Angelou, for instance, is now being banned because it's about race, right? And this is what we see coming from the far right, right? This impulse to ban books that might start larger discussions about the question of race and the way it's been treated historically in the United States of America. But of course, if you talk to somebody on the far left, they'll say one of two different things. I think the first is, this is what I hear all the time. They'll say, well, there's no critical race theory being taught in elementary schools, right? It's just not happening. And that's not true. And I'll tell you why that's not true in a minute. And then I think, some of the more reasonably minded people on the left. And again, I'm somebody who is a diehard liberal. I'm a Democrat. I'm somebody who is staunchly on the left. I think those people don't always know. We don't always know exactly what it is. We know that fighting for racial justice is important, not just as liberals, but as Jews, as Jewish liberals. We know that working toward racial justice is important. And if CRT is the vehicle to do it, then we want to jump on that train, right? The problem is that critical race theory, as it's being conceived broadly, is not in some ways not what it was intended to be. So I'll give you just a little bit of my background. Until a couple of years ago, I was a professor of literature, film, and critical theory, as well as Jewish studies and trauma studies. I have taught critical theory at UCLA, at Pepperdine, and at Loyola Marymount University. I've taught critical race theory. Now, when I taught critical race theory, I taught it as one lens among many, right? So to give you an example, I would assign one novel to the entire class. They would all read the same novel, and they would all choose a different lens through which to read the novel. Okay, so one student might choose feminist studies, another student might choose Marxist studies, another student might choose to look at psychoanalytic theory, and then another student might use the lens of critical race theory to read that novel. So they would all read the novel, and then they would each do a presentation on the novel, having read it through their chosen lens. And the amazing thing is that even though they all read the same novel, every single presentation was different. Why? Because they all used a different lens. And the reason I did it that way is because I wanted to show students that all of these lenses are important, right? We need to look at things through the lens of women's studies, gender studies, feminist studies. We need to look at things through the lens of, power structures and post-colonialism and critical race theory and all of those things. And that's what we need to be doing. But the problem now is that that's not what's happening. For the most part, what's happening in a lot of the institutions that have become problematic is that it's only critical race theory. So what kids in even elementary schools, and I have my own personal experience with this, what kids even in elementary schools are being taught is that all injustice in our society is a direct result of race and racism. And as you can imagine, there are a lot of problems with that. And my time's up, so I'll stop.
Okay. We'll go next to David Bernstein. David is the former head of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs and founder of Cultural Solutions. Take it away, David.
Okay, I'm actually now the founder of a new group called the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, which is an organization that actually works directly with this. And I'm pleased to be here. And thank you all for inviting me. It's also nice to see some familiar faces. I haven't scanned everybody, but I know some of you, and it's wonderful to see you. So I'm going to start from a slightly different place here. To me, critical race theory is part of, and I think Monica actually hit on this, part of a larger suite of frameworks that are used to describe reality. I call this critical social justice. Actually, Robin DiAngelo also called it critical social justice. And the idea is that it has two core observations. And this is shared by, let's say, gender studies or critical fact studies and the like as well. Number one, that racism or bigotry or oppression is not just a matter of an individual's attitudes, right? It is embedded in the very systems and structures of society. That's the first core observation. The second core observation is that only people who are the victims of these systems, only the people who have been adversely affected by this systematic bias, have the insight and the standing to define it. They're the ones who have the lived experience to define it for the rest of society. And so therefore, to a degree, our job is to defer to the people who have had that experience. Now, I think those two things can both be true. In other words, it is true, in my view, that there is often racism and bigotry embedded in systems of society. It is also true that people who experience that bigotry can have a unique insight that the rest of us might not have. As a Jew who's experienced anti-Semitism, I'm in a position to articulate it in a way that maybe a non-Jewish person who's never experienced it. The problem is when that second idea, the idea that only the people who lived the experience can define it, that can be weaponized, and it's often weaponized. And it's used to say, I'm the one who gets to tell you what racism is, and you must listen to this. And that's when it ceases to be just a theoretical lens. It becomes a dogma. It becomes an ideology that is then promulgated in society. And that, to me, is when it becomes a problem. The social psychologist Jonathan Haidt calls critical race theory cuckoo. And he says, not because it's crazy, but because like the cuckoo bird, it tends to push out the birds of other eggs out of its nest. So if you ask me, do I support critical race theory? I will say, well, it depends on what you mean by it. If you mean a lens through which I can understand systematic oppression or systemic oppression, I'll say, yes, of course, that I will want to use that lens in the sense that Monica said. If you say, do I believe it is an all-encompassing ideology that should be imposed upon people and that should be taught to our kids as the only acceptable way of thinking about race and racism? Absolutely not. I think that's fundamentally illiberal and undermines our liberal values in society. And that's really what this comes down to in many ways. Is CRT being taught in the classroom? Well, it depends on, again, what we mean by CRT. If you mean, as I would, that some schools are starting to teach that systemic racism is the way to understand disparities in society, and that there's no other ways of understanding those disparities. There's no other lens, as Monica put it, for understanding those disparities. To me, that's highly problematic. That doesn't mean I support these laws that Chris Rufo and others. I don't. I'm opposed to those laws. I'll say it again. I am opposed to those laws. They also undermine free speech. But do I want my kids, or do I want kids in general, to learn that the only way that they can talk about disparity and to think about disparity is through the lens of systemic racism, whether you call that CRT or not? And the answer is no. I think that's highly illiberal, and I don't think we should want that. So I also think, lastly, and I don't know where I'm at in time, and I forgot to set my timer, unlike Monica.
You're almost up. You're almost up.
Okay, I'll just say one last thing about it, and that is that I do worry that whenever you have an illiberal ideology, when you have an ideology that says this is the only way to understand the truth, that illiberalism almost inevitably will also produce anti-Semitism as well. And I think we as Jews should be very concerned about that. If you have an ideology that somebody gets to define what privilege is, and I can tell you exactly who's privileged and who's not, the idea of Jewish privilege is not far away. If you believe if you believe in the definition of equity that you often hear, and you believe that the racism is the only reason why some groups have more and some groups have less, then the groups have more, like Jews and like Asians, are going to be targeted. And so I think we have to be very careful about these concepts, and we have to be willing to debate them so that we can have rich, thoughtful conversations about them. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And lastly, but not least, Professor Sam Edelman.
Yep.
Sam?
Yep. Let me get my timer started. Okay. Hold on 1 second. All right. So, I'm going to agree with everything that everyone else has said. And I'm going to add to the definition of CRT that clearly CRT, from my perspective, is an example of one methodology of looking at how race has affected the United States, and this concept that it's systemic is very important, that it permeates all aspects of American society. Is a very interesting idea. But I want to jump into this now in a different way. The Jewish community, and especially Jewish Democrats, are between a rock and a hard place on the issue of CRT, of critical race theory. And why are they between a rock and a hard place? We're going to be condemned if we support CRT, and we're going to be condemned if we oppose CRT. It's already happening. We're seeing our co-brethren and sisterin in the Republican Jewish coalition, caucus, already attacking Jewish Democrats for not coming out in opposition to critical race theory, and therefore being not supportive of Israel. We see our friends and colleagues on the left also condemning us for not supporting critical race theory. sufficiently, and therefore not being part of the larger interest that the progressive community has. And I'm like Monica, I have been involved in teaching critical race theory for many decades now as a part of teaching intercultural communication. And as we've all said, others have said, this is one lens among many lenses in how to look at race. Race is in and of itself a completely false theory, false vision, false perspective. Race does not, according to both anthropology and sociology and psychology and even the physical sciences and the medical sciences, race really doesn't exist as anything. If you take the blood of one group and put it, and if it's the type A, and you put it into another type A type A blood or whatever into another person who's from another ethnic group, it's all going to work. It's skin tone, hair color. All these are surface kinds of things that have no meaning whatsoever, have nothing to do with intellectual capability, have nothing to do with anything else. And what's more important in understanding who we are and what we are is ethnicity. And yes, America more and more is becoming a community of minorities, not a community of majority. There's no real majority. There is a majority of minorities today. And for the most part, critical race theory should be defined in a way as critical anti-race theory, because it's in opposition to race and is trying to effectively, through, as David said quite correctly, through social justice, to rectify the horrors that race theory has perpetrated on people, especially on African Americans. My problem with critical race theory, though, is the problem that has been, I've seen over the last few decades, is that there has been a systemic dislocation, separation of Jews, Jewish interests, Israel and Zionism, from the discussion of both intersectionality and critical race theory. Even though in the history of race, the race theory that was originally created at the end of in the 1600s to justify three things. Original race theory was created in Europe to do three things. One, it was to justify slavery. Two, it was used to justify anti-Semitism. And three, it was used to justify the subjugation of other peoples through colonialism. Those three things were what the original race theories were created for. They morphed into, in the 19th century, into a whole pseudoscience called eugenics, which was very popular in the United States, including Leland Stanford and others in California who promoted a kind of racial theories which effectively disenfranchised African Americans, Native Americans, Asians, Jews, a whole host, the mentally disabled people in general. All of these people were suffered under eugenics rules, regulations, and laws that were put in place in the United States and later in Europe in the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. And those same eugenic theories ultimately would become the basis for the Nazi Holocaust. The problem that we face is that we are today affected very much by, and should be using tools like critical race theory, but on the left, we are not included. Jews are not included in those theories and in that discussion. And in fact, we're excluded because we are privileged, and some say even privileged white people, and therefore should not be included. But on the other side, on the right, with white supremacists and all of the neo-Nazis and a variety of different other groups on the right who are anti-Semitic from the right, we are also part and parcel, a central part and parcel of the impact of racism on who we are and who we and our lives. The murder rate, the physical attacks on Jews, and the rise of anti-Semitism, bar none, is as higher than any other ethnic group in the United States today. So let me say in quick conclusion, our problem here is that while critical race theory is an important tool, it is only important if it includes Jews, and I would also argue Asians, in its purview, to look at racism as it's had an impact on all those who have suffered under racism for all these centuries. And I'm going to stop there and say, we have a problem, we must address it directly. And one of the other issues that needs to be addressed is an open dialogue with the African-American community and with other ethnic and minority communities who view themselves as being sole sufferers of the impact of racism, and for us to say, me too.
Thank you, Sam. I want to add in briefly, I didn't say that Sam's the executive director of the New Academic Council for Israel, a member of the Academic Engagement Network, a member of the Jewish Battleground Coalition, and active in the Florida Jewish Democratic Caucus. I'm going to start with a question for the whole panel. I see your hand up, Monica, but I'm going to ask the question and then I'll actually toss it to you so you can answer it first. And then currently in elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools, and for the past 100 years, people learn about slavery, Reconstruction, KKK, Jim Crow, civil rights. They learn now about Barack Obama, our first Black president. For years, this has been considered basic American history. It's been considered civics education. Why has this standard curriculum that we probably all learned and our kids have learned come under fire by the GOP? You see this in Texas and Arizona and some in Florida as critical race theory. How has this happened? And I'll toss it to you, Monica, since you wanted to add something, and then you can answer that question.
Sure. Let me just answer your question and then I'll add what I wanted to add.
Okay.
So, what is coming from the far right in terms of, trying to ban discussions of American history and the history of race and racism, all of which is legitimate in American history. This impulse, my personal opinion, in many cases is racism, but in other cases, I think it's very much about power. I think we are a very polarized and divided society right now, and CRT is like the linchpin for all of this in many cases. So I think that, the GOP is capitalizing on, what some of, some of the conservatives have legitimate concerns about what is happening in classrooms. And again, I'll tell you what happened in my child's classroom in a progressive school in Hollywood. It was very much, some of the things we hear conservatives talking about, and we say, well, that's crazy. That's not happening. It is happening, and the reason is, and I'm going to go back to what I wanted to add, then I'll go back to your question. What none of us mentioned, and I'm shocked that none of us really used this term, is the idea of the binary. Critical race theory depends on a binary of oppressor and oppressed, okay? So you're either an oppressor or you are oppressed. Well, where does that leave Jews? Where does that leave American Jews, right? Jews are always going to problematize these kinds of binaries, these kinds of either or things. And this has happened in virtually every social and cultural and critical movement. The Jews are always there to kind of problemize this either or thinking. So then if we're talking about what's going on in the classroom, again, there are legitimate concerns. And if I hadn't experienced it myself, I might not believe it. And I've written about this for the Forward and for Newsweek. If you want to know the details, you can look it up. But, just a little bit of what happened is we had an anti-bias facilitator come into the school to educate the parents. Now, this is the most diverse private school in Los Angeles. It is progressive, it is liberal, it was a wonderful, beautiful, diverse place. And that's why we chose the school. In other words, there were no issues that needed to be fixed there, quite frankly. But, you know, as everybody was doing last year, bringing in anti-bias facilitators, a woman came in and did a session, and she drew from the work of Angela Davis and Ibram Kendi, and she kept talking about bias. So as a Jewish studies professor, as a liberal Jew, as someone who's taught critical race theory, I felt that it was my responsibility to ask a question. And I said, I'm just curious how you, how do you navigate some of Angela Davis's anti-Semitism since we're talking about bias and implicit bias? How do you handle that? Her answer to me in front of the entire school was, you shouldn't be asking questions about anti-Semitism. What you should be doing is celebrating the achievements and accomplishments of a Black woman. And that was it. So what do you do with that, right? Where do the Jews fit into this binary of oppressor and oppressed? So we have legitimate things like that happening at schools and in classrooms. That the school ended up changing the entire curriculum to be, in a math class, they now teach about how numbers have been used against the Black community. They're not teaching math in every instance. They're teaching about racism, right? And it's just the wrong venue for it. And I'll stop.
Does anyone else want to add into my initial
I would
question
love to.
and the comments Monica made?
Right, I would love to.
Okay,
That's
David,
okay.
and then Cary.
So let me just say, I know this is a group of Democrats, and I've been a lifelong Democrat. My first job was working for the Clinton-Gore campaign in 1992. If Democrats view this as just a Republican manipulation, we will be done. You will elect Trump. And the reason is that everybody knows, any parent who's seen it understands that this is a real problem. It doesn't mean that the Republicans are characterizing it correctly. They are very often are not. I don't think there should be legislation banning discussion of CRT. There should not. But there is a real issue about the way that this discussion is taking place in schools, outside schools, and corporations and nonprofits. When you're part of when you go take a diversity training and you're part of a health and human services organization and you have to take a session on decolonizing data, you know that there's a problem. There is an ideology. It is becoming more pervasive. It is an ideology that shuts down legitimate discussion. It is affecting the way we think and talk about ideas and making it very hard for people to have the kind of open and honest discussion that we're having here today. I can tell you that if you look at the Virginia gubernatorial race, Terry McAuliffe has been very quick to say that there's no such thing about a CRT in schools. It's a fabrication, and he is going to lose a state that Biden won by 10. He might lose a state that Biden won by 10 points, and his opponent is going to exploit that, as he should, mercilessly, because that's what. So I think we have to understand that this is a real issue, and if we're in denial about this, then we're going to make it. It's going to be very, very hard for Democrats to win races in the future.
Cary, you wanted to comment?
So I think it's inevitable that whenever one tries to make generalities about either American education or critical race theory, and you're talking about decades and decades of practices, you're in trouble and you'll say things that I think are not quite on target. So I don't think that the teaching of racial history in the United States has a 100-year history, as was claimed. That's just not an accurate picture of practices all across the country for the last 100 years. So it's more complicated than that. And even in the North, it's complicated as well as in the South. I want to begin by saying that I did expect to be in a little more disagreement with the rest of the panel. And so I'll have to crawl away in chagrin that I really didn't have a lot of disagreement with what anyone else has said. Obviously, bad choices were made in putting this group together because we should have had some, real figure of disruption here, and we didn't succeed. So I'll proceed despite that limitation. Look, I think I'm no expert in K-12 education. I have no children. I do have a dog, but no children, and so my relationship to it is vague at best. the one thing I have invested in from time to time is talking to K-12 teachers about whether they have any academic freedom or not. And the answer is that they don't. They really don't have anything that's the equivalent of academic freedom. The state is taken, the whole history of the law is that the states, individual states, have a huge investment in what happens in K-12 and huge rights to regulate it. And that's why those laws are so terrifying and coercive, because in the K-12 arena, they really can work and they really can constrain what people teach. So the dangers in the attempts to exclude not just CRT, but really anything to do with race that can be linked to CRT represent a real effort to overturn at least decades of race-related teaching in the United States. It is also true that when you take complex ideas like CRT and try to boil them down to what you can teach to little kids, you can get into trouble. However, that trouble is no longer limited to K-12, since I think those simplicities dominate humanities and social science teaching on colleges and university campuses. And there, unfortunately, I do know more than I might wish to know, since most of the knowledge isn't particularly cheering. I'm sorry, yeah.
Oh, yeah. So I want to move on to a question that is a very good question from one of our audience members. Elizabeth Webster asked, where do Jews of color fit into this narrative? And there was a question here too about why we do not have someone of color on this panel. And we had two different speakers who had to drop out for a variety of reasons, unfortunately. And we do apologize for that, because we do agree with you that there should have been a Jew of color on this panel. But in response to Elizabeth Webster's question, where do Jews of color fit in this narrative that we've been discussing, and who would like to take that question?
Well, in as much as Jews of color are in a position, a positive and negative position within the Jewish community, both in the United States and in Israel. And there have been benefits for the immigration of Jews from Ethiopia and other areas of Africa who may either be converts or Jews who were resided in Africa who've come to Israel to live. And within Israel itself, there's been a whole program or process of trying to deal with issues of race. In the Jewish community itself, there are two concerns. One is there's a question of what's the real number of the number of Jews of color in the Jewish community in the United States. The Pew report says one thing. There's been another study that said it's something else. There's my good friend and colleague Ira Sheshkin, who's been involved in Jewish demographics, has talked about this issue, and we think that there's somewhere around 6% to a little bit more than that. I don't want to get into the numbers, but there is an attempt on the part of the Jewish institutions to make sure that Jews of color have a respected place and have funding and support for interests that they have and are fully included in the community, while at the same time there is inherent bias by a small percentage of Jews in the Jewish community. And so we have this kind of strange situation where we embrace our brothers and sisters who are Jews of color fully, for the most part, especially those who were involved in more liberal forms of Jewish religious expression. But in other areas, there is some, what goes on in the United States has an impact on everyone, including Jews. So that's the kind of continuum that Jews of color exist in the United States. I'm hoping, and I'm almost positive, that the institutional structures of the Jewish community in the United States are doing as much as they can, and even though they should probably do more, to be inclusive of and bring in Jews of color into our community. And I know for a fact that many synagogues that I've been affiliated with and others that I've not, who I have friends in, who have Jews of color in it, are very, outreach is very important.
Monica,
Just
what are
add
your
one thing,
thoughts?
Joe?
Oh, okay, go ahead, David.
I just want to add one thing, that I think it's important that we not essentialize Jews of color as if they, and I'm not saying you did that, Sam, I'm just saying that as if they are a monolithic group. First of all, there's huge differences on what we mean by Jews of color, but also Jews of color, Black Jews or anybody else, disagree with each other on all sorts of things. And you can see this in the data. There's a lot of surveys about how African Americans think about issues and so forth. They don't all agree, just like Jews don't all agree. So I just co-wrote a letter about concerns on the teaching of systemic racism in a Jewish day school with a Black Jewish woman from Philadelphia named Brandy Shafatinsky, who is a social worker, a PhD educator, and a diversity trainer. And she happens to agree that it's problematic to have what she would call a CRT-based educational curriculum in schools. So, I mean, again, and there are many more that people like Brandy who don't necessarily agree with this. And I think that's why I think it's important that we allow ourselves to have these discussions no matter who's in the room. It's great to include people of color in every conversation we have. We should do our best. We should have Jewish institutions that are inclusive, but we can have conversations because, again, I happen to be a half Iraqi Jew, and that has really nothing to do with what my opinion is today. I just happen to have an individual with an opinion that I'm sharing with you today and not representing anybody but myself.
And
Well,
Monica, since you,
oh.
I'm going to stop for 1 second. Monica, since you have taught critical race theory, what are your thoughts on this idea of, the views of where does a Jewish Black person fit in this structure? Since you've taught it, I'd be interested to see what you have to say as well.
Yeah, I'm glad the question is being raised because it's a really important question. And this just to kind of really add on.
Who is this?
Just to kind of add on to what David was saying. Not all Jews of color think alike. Not all Black Americans have homogenous views. You may or may not know that there's a whole growing roster of Black heterodox voices opposing this kind of binary discussion of race in classrooms and in culture. People like John McWhorter, who's now writing regularly for the New York Times, people like Thomas Chatterton Williams, and so many other Black intellectuals who are speaking out against this. And again, these, some of them are conservative, but many of them are liberals, are progressives. Many of them are progressives who have been deeply wounded by some of the things that the progressive movement is doing in terms of the people they include and the people they exclude. And I think a lot of it has to do with, what for, the CRT movement, which it either is or isn't, an accurate reflection of what it was meant to be. And that doesn't matter at this point. But, the people behind this movement very much have a script that needs to be followed. In many ways, it's as if you deviate from this script, it doesn't matter how progressive you are. It doesn't matter how liberal you are. You don't get to be part of the movement. And so again, as a Jew, if I question a moment of anti-Semitism in the progressive movement or in the progressive values, I'm excluded. I'm kicked out of my own house. And I think that's a problem. And I think that more and more Jews are experiencing this. And I also think that especially Jews of color are experiencing this.
I just wanted to say
go ahead,
briefly,
Cary.
because the question was raised, how do Jews of color fit into the narrative? And I think, first of all, David's right that they're they're very diverse, especially if you add multiple countries, Israel, United States, et cetera. They're not just one thing, but both in Israel and here and in Europe, the great power that Jews of color have is to disrupt every binary narrative about race that standardly operates. And that's, are Jews white, are Jews black, who's subject to more or less discrimination? Well, in Israel, some Jews of color are subject to more discrimination than other Jews of color, depending upon which micro category they're placed in. So I think it's the wonderful thing about including them in the conversation is that life gets complicated in productive ways.
So the originator, and I think this was mentioned by Monica, of critical race theory is a gentleman named Professor Derek Bell, who was originally at Harvard, then he was at NYU. And he concluded that racism is so deeply rooted in the makeup of American society that it's been able to reassert itself after each successive wave of reform, like Reconstruction, civil rights, voting rights. He had a very certain view of race in America. He essentially believed, it was a very pessimistic view, that racism is permanent, that no matter what changes we make, racism will always be in the system. Is this something addressed to all four of you? Do you agree with this assessment? And can the same be said about anti-Semitism? We as Jews have always hear the longest hatred, the everlasting hatred is anti-Semitism. It's the hatred that's been around for all eternity. Is there a cure for embedded hatred, whether it's embedded racism, embedded anti-Semitism? Do you agree with Derek Bell that we cannot recover from systemic racism? And is there a way to recover from anti-Semitism? Who wants to start?
Let's start.
Okay.
I would say that I disagree with Derek Bell. I don't have such a pessimistic view. I think while there continues to be much racism in American society, I also think there's been incredible progress. Today, 2/3 of Black Americans live in the middle class and above. That is incredible progress in the past several decades. Again, doesn't excuse the fact that there continues to be racism and that there continues to be serious disparities, especially in the criminal justice system. But I don't think racism is as pervasive in every nook and cranny of society as sort of that orientation would have you believe. Part of this orientation believes fundamentally that racism is almost coded in our culture, that every aspect of our culture, when we talk, when we celebrate, that it's all based on sort of what's sometimes referred to as whiteness, that which is a white dominant culture, which is inherently racist. I don't think that that's true. I think every country in the world has a culture or cultures, and I don't think that there's anything inherently racist about American culture. That doesn't mean that there aren't relics of racism to be found in it, and that we shouldn't root those out. We should, but we shouldn't. I don't think it's helpful to think of as America as pervasively racist, and that it actually prevents you from solving real problems and really dealing with problems. If racism is everywhere, then it's nowhere. If racism is embedded in every single police force, then you can't actually solve real problems and make policing more humane. And so I think it's not helpful and it's not true. And that we have to have a much richer and more thoughtful conversation that allows us to either agree or disagree. Like, I can be convinced on a lot of these issues, but one of the problems I'm having with the way that this discourse often takes place is that people say, I'm sorry, but you must agree with me that systemic racism is everywhere, or you're disqualified from this conversation. And once you do that, it's impossible really to be able to address these problems and to think them through together. And for me to actually be wrong, because I can be wrong.
Would someone else like to add to this? Because I also want to answer to the question, Monica, your hand is raised, but about, do you feel the same way about anti-Semitism too? Because I think that's interesting as a parallel thought process. Monica?
Okay, so in a startling turn of events, I'm going to say that while I don't completely disagree with David, I don't know that I fully agree. I think that racism, like anti-Semitism, is ever present. I think it waxes and wanes. And I think we see this especially with anti-Semitism and or anti-Jewish racism, whatever you want to call it. It depends on all sorts of circumstances. But I think that, in some ways, I think that we're just kind of, biologically, or it's probably not the right word, hardwired to be suspicious of difference, right? And difference is always going to be among us. So I think that, we have times where we work to fight against it and it gets better. And then when we let our guard down, it rears its ugly head again. And I think that, it's always going to go back and forth, whether it's racism or anti-Semitism. And so we always have to be vigilant, and we do have to fight against both of these things all of the time. Now, to the question of whether it's ever going to be eradicated completely, I don't think so. Neither one of these. Anti-Semitism is never going to go away. And that's why we have so many Jewish organizations fighting against anti-Semitism and raising awareness of anti-Semitism, because we know from history that it's always been with us. It's as old as the world, and it's always going to be with us. We always have to fight it. So why would racism be any different, is my question. And I don't think it is. However, I think that what's not happening is that certain people in the movement are not wanting to acknowledge, as David said, the strides that have been made, the improvements, the way things are getting better, the way, we are not who we were in the 1950s.
Oh, finally, I have a disagreement to make. I guess I partly stand with Monica. I think that what David's argument basically goes something like this. Look, we really aren't killing as many Blacks as we did 100 years ago. Things have improved. I don't think that when you begin with the sort of, this self-satisfaction of progress rather than the persistence of evil, you're going to lose reality and lose your ability to be honest. Can racism be eliminated? In this country, no. Can it be ameliorated? Yes. I mean, I maintain it's the delusion on which my life is founded, that education can help you make progress, and that people can unlearn their hatreds, and they don't have to be taught them initially. But it's so deeply embedded in this country that I see no reason of leaving it behind, or no way of leaving it behind, or at least I'll make a prediction. Racism will not be eliminated in the US while any of us are still alive. We will not see the day when it has been cured, but it can be ameliorated. Do I think most police departments are racist? Probably. Certainly everyone that I've had any contact with is racist. So, is every police officer racist? No. But at the ground level, before you reach the level of hatred, you have to deal with the fact that the US is a supremely race-conscious society. You can lose your awareness of race in personal relations, but in anonymous relations, it's very hard to overcome the sort of foregrounding of race in your personal awareness of the world around you. And for it to be eliminated, we have to get past that point. I don't see it happening.
Thank you. Now, we've reached the 3 o'clock hour. Unfortunately, I think I could have this conversation, at least I could, for the next 2 or 3 hours. I find it really, really interesting, but unfortunately, people have places to go and people to see, and we can't continue speaking. This has been such an interesting and really important conversation because the idea behind critical race theory impacts us as both Jews and Americans and people who care about open and honest discussion about these issues. We as the Jewish Battleground Coalition really appreciate the ability to have a calm, thought out, nuanced discussion about a topic that can really be difficult and often leads to heated discussions on both the left and the right. So I want to thank Monica Osbourne, Samuel Edelman, Cary Nelson, and David Bernstein, and the entire Jewish Battleground Coalition. This Zoom event is being recorded, and everyone who registered and attended will get a copy of it for future use. It will also be on the DJOP YouTube channel. I want to thank our JBC partners from our battleground states. And again, hearty thanks to Professor Sam Edelman, who really helped get these fabulous speakers. And Monica, you've come the furthest, sort of, from Italy. So thank you. I know it's late there. And thank you all for attending a Jewish Battleground Coalition event. We really appreciate your attendance, and we will be sending out not only the video, but a series of articles for you to read on the topic. So thank you, and have a good afternoon or morning or whatever time it is wherever you are. So thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thanks to
Thank
everybody.
you.
Yeah.